Here is Chapter 7 of how Moons of Darsalon was made, the video game for which I sued the Spanish government for unjustly disqualifying it from a €5 million grant. The trial lasted 4 years, and I might one day make a series of videos dedicated to telling the whole story, since no traditional or YouTube-based gaming media has wanted to cover the case. Anyway, in the previous chapter, we saw how Moons of Darsalon doesn't use traditional methods to animate sprites. Instead, it has an animation system with separate body parts that are animated independently, triggering different animations according to specific criteria for each body part. The jump animation is a bit special because it's not a single animation cycle. There's one animation for going up and another for going down. Actually, there are 4, a pair for jumping forward and another for jumping in place. The character controller triggers the upward jump animation when the jump starts, freezing it on the last frame as the character continues to ascend. Once it detects that the character starts to descend, the downward jump animation is triggered. This allows me to adjust the height at which characters jump, and the jump animation will always respond correctly. It also ensures that when you do a level jump down, which has a minimal upward trajectory, the legs move as expected. But what about the torso? Before explaining how the torso works, let's talk about the jetpack. Both the legs and torso detect whether the vertical velocity is positive or negative. In other words, whether the character is going up or down or maintaining a relatively stable height. This way, the legs trigger different animations for each case, achieving a much more natural movement. The torso doesn't trigger animations, but uses the first frame of each running animation with its different inclinations, also taking into account the upward or downward velocity, simulating a kind of natural physical behavior. Something similar happens in the previously mentioned jump animation, although not as obviously, but it adds an extra touch of realism. Let's talk now about aiming. How do other 2D twin-stick games handle aiming animations? They usually create a sprite of the weapon without arms, just the hand, rotate it, and that's it. Not very pleasant. With a bit more effort, you can add arms, but what happens if it's pixel art when you rotate it? It would condemn us to an eternity of suffering in the pixel art hell. Well, not in Moons of Darsalon, because with the rendering system it uses, rotated pixels can't be generated. However, a small rotated sprite produces chaotic results. The GPU struggles to decide where each pixel should go, and while its decisions might be mathematically correct, artistically, they're a disaster. That's why Moons of Darsalon uses 10 sprites for the first 90 degrees. And with inversions and 90-degree rotations, which produce perfect rotations, the rest is achieved. The arm script, which for simplicity combines both arms into a single sprite, uses these 10 sprites and the angle of the right stick to decide which sprite to display, rotating it 0 degrees with no inversion, 270 degrees, or minus 90 degrees with no inversion, 90 degrees with the X scale inverted, or 0 degrees with the X scale inverted. This, combined with the inclination of the torso, results in much more natural and expressive aiming positions than the typical method of a rigid body with arms that rotate a single sprite. There is also a fake weight on the weapons to simulate the bobbing effect when jumping, which naturally affects shooting accuracy. However, this effect is minimized when aiming with the right stick. Even with the slight remaining sway, the jump animation looks much more natural. Now, in the previous chapter on animations, we talked about how indie games usually handle the distance to the ground by letting the rigid body with a curved collider collide with the ground. But how does Moons of Darsalon do it? The characters do have a rigid body and colliders, but not at the height of the feet. The colliders are located in the torso and head to prevent them from passing through walls. However, there's no collider on the legs making contact with the ground, which didn't work well, especially in a game with terrain composed of completely irregular polygons. Instead, the character detects the distance to the ground using a raycast shot from the waist and applies the necessary vertical force to maintain the correct height. This approach prevents the character from getting stuck on small terrain irregularities. Essentially, any obstacle or ramp shorter than the character's waist can be overcome by walking. If the character encounters a step while moving forward, the detected distance will prompt the script to apply a slightly greater force, with the distance adjusting over the following frames. This adjustment happens quickly enough to prevent the character from sinking into the ground, but not so quickly that height changes result in abrupt movements. Let's talk about ladders now. How do indie or classic arcade games usually handle ladder animations? Unfortunately, quite poorly. Even in some of my favorite games, which are excellent in almost every aspect, when it comes to ladders, For some reason, the sliding and running animations isn't too painful to watch. In some cases, it's even charming. But the sliding on ladders is much more noticeable. How does Moons of Darsalon handle ladders? For simplicity, once you start climbing a ladder, the torso sprite also includes the arms, while the legs are again responsible for the metadata that determines movement, this time moving up or down instead of side to side. Ladders in the game have a special script for colliders, similar to the floor of vehicle loading areas and other colliders with unique properties. This script, among other functions, provides important data that characters can access when they step on these surfaces or grab onto them. In this case, the data we're interested in is the distance between rungs, because this determines where the foot that's bearing the weight should be placed at any moment. This helps avoid those annoying sliding issues. By knowing the ladder's coordinates and the distance between rungs, we can calculate the coordinates of each rung and snap to them while climbing. This, combined with the frame-by-frame advanced metadata, produces a much better ladder climbing animation, provided we've drawn the frames with the understanding that all ladders have the same rung spacing. Yes, I know. According to what I mentioned earlier, the rung spacing could vary between ladders, right? It could, but if it doesn't match the spacing in the animations, the hands will still grip the ladder sides properly. The feet will still snap to the rungs, but might be a slight glitch between rungs. Still, I would say it feels better than not taking rung snapping into account. There are also special animations for entering or exiting the ladder from or to the upper level, something introduced by Donkey Kong and later used by Ghosts and Goblins and its sequels in a particularly amusing way. However, this feature wasn't widely adopted by other games, though I believe it's essential to maintain the smoothness and natural feel of the other animations. There's also a set of swimming animations, which we might cover in the chapter dedicated to liquids. And this is the end of Chapter 7 of how Moons of Darsalon was made. In the next chapter, I'm not entirely sure what the focus will be. Aside from 2D liquid physics, I have many topics to cover, like character AI in both their walking and flying versions, sound design, optimization techniques, and more. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it.